Google was fined by the National Control Authority, the French CNIL, about, I think, 100,000 euro because they collected the Wi-Fi data unlawfully. And we calculated, as experts at the time, we calculated it was about 2 minutes of their turnover, of their global turnover. Or I calculated it was like 2 or 3 days of coffee budget for the engineers. So it was really not, it was really not very convincing. These regulations.
This is 20-Minute JavaScript, a weekly show where I, your host, interview members of the JavaScript community about all topics concerning JavaScript. The 20-Minute JavaScript show is brought to you by OpenReplay, an open source session replay platform meant for developers. If you'd like to know more, visit openreplay.com. If you'd like to be on the show or suggest a topic, find us on Twitter at the20MinJS. Welcome to episode number 28. I'm Fernando, your host, and today I'm going to be interviewing Thiébaut Devergranne. He's a developer-turned-lawyer who's made his mission in life to know everything there is to know about GDPR, and we're going to be talking about it. What is it, and most importantly, why you as a developer should care about it. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Thibaut, and please introduce yourself to our audience.
All right, thank you and welcome for having me on the show. So I'm Thiébaut Devergranne. I'm specialized in IT law for about now 20 years. So I'm really specialized in GDPR regulations. I advised the French Prime Minister administration on GDPR compliance while we were negotiating on GDPR. I did my PhD in IIT law. I've been working in this field for a very, very long time. So there's everything related to privacy regulation, in particular GDPR, I can say I'm already highly specialized on it. And maybe one particularity of my profile is that I have my lawyer side, but I also have been developing for 20 years. So I'm trying to make the bridge between the legal side, the legal world, and also the developer world. So today it will be very interesting to have discussions, not only in regard to just the regulations themselves, but how it can translate into code. What, for example, actions you can do as a developers, or what things you need to be aware of when it comes to these regulations. So it will be hopefully a very interesting discussion today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you definitely have a profile I've never seen before, a developer turned lawyer who actually specialized on GDPR. So it's a very interesting combination and useful, I guess, in today's world. So let's dive right into it. Let's start with the most basic question because I don't know if everyone is completely aware of it. So what is GDPR and why should developers care about it?
Yeah, so GDPR, I can say from really in terms of practical standpoint, it's the most important regulation nearly in the world. Why? It's a really IT regulation that regulates how developers or how organizations need to process personal data or any data related to natural persons. So why is it the most? It's been in 2016, 2018. It's been the most important revolution in law because the GDPR combines two things. The first one is a huge scope. Any organization that is processing data that's just related to one person, one natural person. For example, you're processing your first name, a last name, you're processing email address, you're processing video data, sounds, anything that can identify directly or indirectly natural persons. And if this data is related to people in the EU, GDPR applies, and the regulation is actually quite long, a little bit complicated. Maybe not for developers, because developers are not usually concerned with all the scope of the regulation, most the part related to data. And the thing is, we had this regulation. The truth is, we had these regulations since 1995. There was a directive before in 1995. Even in France, there was a regulation in 1978. So very, very old regulation, but there was no fines. Basically, you could do pretty much whatever you wanted. There was very little fines, and the GDPR changed this. To give you an example, in about, I think it was 2007, 8, Google was fined by the National Control Authority, the French CNIL, about, I think, 100,000 euro, because they collected the Wi-Fi data unlawfully. And we calculated, as experts at the time, we calculated it was about 2 minutes of their turnover, of their global turnover, or I calculated it was like 2 or 3 days of coffee budget for the engineers. So it was really not, it was really not very convincing.
Yeah.
This regulation existed, but there was no real fines, and this is the biggest revolution. Is that now this regulation has to apply, and if companies do not comply with this, there are considerable amounts of fines. It can go to up to 4% of the global turnover, which means for a company like Amazon, to give you an example, what's the amount of fines? It can go up to 7 billion euros fine for a company like Amazon. So to give you an idea, that's 22 million Apple Watch. So it's difficult to process, the amount
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the
yeah.
volume, the extent of what it means, 7 billion. But that's really a lot. That's really a lot. So this is why it's important. As soon as you will process EU people who are located in EU, you process their data, you have to comply with GDPR. So it's very wide and very important, and also quite detailed regulation.
Absolutely, yeah. And yeah, even though the GDPR affects people in Europe, like you mentioned, it's something that globally every developer should know and be aware of, because I mean, in the end, everyone is using applications and accessing services from all around the world. So it's not that easy to work around it or avoid it, and even worse for companies, especially companies. I'm assuming that like provide services, worldwide services. That's gotta be a pain. But if GDPR is a EU thing only, are there equivalents around the world, things that or similar regulations, and what are the more significant ones?
Yeah, basically, the question is there a way around this? There's no way
Right.
around this. Anywhere you are in the world, you're going to have to at some point, one day or another, you're going to have to look at these regulations. Why? A few things. The first one is. Um, the scope of the GDPR is, of course, inside EU. So if you're an EU company, you just have to comply with this because it's EU regulation. If you're outside the EU and you process data of people who are located in EU, you're going to have to comply also with the GDPR. So that's the first. The scope is quite wide. If you want to have, if you are developing an app and you're thinking, okay, I will have some international growth, and you're thinking to go, all over the globe. There's no way around it. You're going to have to comply with it. So not only you have to take in consideration these aspects, but also because of this extraterritorial scope, if you want, also other countries and other basically other regulations started to grow because GDPR set up a standard. And now, for example, I can give you this very few people know about it, but China actually adopted, they literally copy pasted the GDPR and they adopted as their own regulation. They made a few modifications in regard to where you can host data. So that's one big difference. But first you have Europe, then now you have China that has the same regulation. In United States, traditionally it was freedom of circulation of data and no regulation, but because a US company had also to comply with the GDPR regulations, they have to set up a privacy standard. And now, of course, you can start to see regulations like the Consumer Act in California, which also sets a privacy standard. It's a GDPR light. But basically, you have to ask yourself, why do we have regulations? And the reality is we have a lot of problems. That's why we have regulations, is because at the end of the day, we're processing a lot of personal data. We're processing a lot of data of consumers, of natural people, and you have security breach, you have data that is kept forever, you have processing of data that is not transparent. Some organizations are processing data people never thought about the extent of processing, and this data can create damages. The processing can create a damage, and that's the reason fundamentally why we have this regulation, is because certain type of processing can cause quite a lot of extended damage to natural persons, and this is where regulation starts to kick in, where we say no, that's actually that's too much. It can create too much damage. For example, if you're processing medical data and you don't have security with it, then you can have ransomware in hospitals that can hit hospitals, and then patients cannot get proper health care, and that's a huge problem. And at the core of this, GDPR regulation, normally, if the organization complies with it, should prevent these risks, and that's why we have these regulations. And so sooner or later, if you're a developer, you're thinking, okay, is it a good idea to take a look at these regulations? Is it going to come in my own country? Sooner or later, it's going to come because of the fundamental nature of these problems, and it's related to the processing itself that create risks.
Right. So that's GDPR, and that's why we have it. One clear effect that the GDPR has had on even on normal users, I think, if you've been in Europe all the time, maybe it's not that obvious, but if you come from outside, you'll start seeing it. Is that cookie warning on every single freaking app that you use everywhere, and every time you visit a web page, you're asked about the cookies and if you want to accept or reject or whatever. That doesn't happen everywhere. So what kind of other impact has the GDPR had on the IT industry that is not that visible to everyone?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. Actually, everyone is blaming GDPR for these cookie pop-ups that pop literally everywhere. It's actually not the GDPR who imposed
Oh, really?
these rules. No, it's actually not at all. It's a very old.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's very funny because I always take this analogy that everyone is blaming a compiler for code errors you wrote yourself. It's a little bit like, oh, this is very bad. This compiler is horrible, but actually, it's absolutely not the case. It's actually quite an old regulation that's called. That was originally the e-privacy directive, and this regulation was not should have been updated with the GDPR. And the reality it's an old regulation from 2002, and originally it was created because at the time we thought, okay, a lot of tracking can happen, and so if natural person are to be tracked, they should at least give consent to this. And I don't know exactly, and this regulation should have been updated uh, to make things more simple, just and to avoid these cookie pop-ups all the time. And honestly, I don't know how much time globally we're losing with this,
Yeah.
but if you add the amounts of minutes everyone is losing every day clicking these pop-ups, it's probably a huge amount of time. So this regulation is called e-privacy. It was a directive. It should be updated as a regulation, but it hasn't been. Everyone is waiting for this, and I don't know why, but everyone blamed GDPR for it. It's not GDPR, so you have to blame this update that hasn't been done. Now, to say already, I've been in this field for 20 years, so I've seen before GDPR what happened. So not much. A few companies were really interested in applying privacy regulations. You had, for example, CAC 40 companies in France, so very, very big companies. You had a company working in health sector, and since 2018, I have to say the change is pretty massive. So it's kind of a slow change. We see a lot of IT teams started to understand. Okay, it's a problem. We can't put this on the side. Fines are huge, and we've seen a lot of, for example, when we have customers coming, there's a lot of DevOps process that has to be in place. DevSecOps processes that have to be in place to ensure that when you deploy an app, now it's more secure. There's a lot of work that's been done on developer side to really think what kind of data we should really collect and what's the data we should erase at some point. So there's been really a huge work done by software editors, by businesses to rethink what kind of data we collect, how we can delete this data when it's not used anymore. And step by step, the industry really has been transformed since these last 4 years. It's still slow, there's still a lot of work to do. But we're heading in the right direction. I think this regulation in 10 years will be really well. A lot of companies will really comply with it. Now, I see everywhere um, some improvements in whether it's from terms of services or whether it's from clarity in regard to information given to what is done with your own data. So a lot of progress. Uh, we're still not there yet. There's still a lot of problems, but a huge improvement for sure.
Okay, interesting. And to that point, I worked as a software architect for many years, and I remember 4 or 5 years ago, even here in Europe, the thought of having two specific industries that I work with, which is healthcare and banking, having those platforms working on the cloud was like people will laugh at you because of security issues, because of privacy, and so on. Do you think a regulation like GDPR is paving the way to allowing like a more secure environment in the cloud where these super restrictive industries can, and with good reason, obviously, can start seeing the cloud as a potential platform for them to develop and grow?
Yeah, I mean, the cloud, there's not a lot of problem with the cloud operators. Actually, when you look at their GDPR compliance, they are very, because they have so many customers. For example, I audited the AWS contracts, and I look at them in very big detail. And most of the time, it's very well done, contrary to what you could initially think about. From contractual perspective, it's usually very well thought, and they deploy a ton of compliance processes inside. I just have to think why. Why? Because they have a ton of customers, and a lot of them. For example, if you think every time you're thinking enterprise, you have to think that inside these massive companies, you have GDPR experts, lawyers who really look in detail about the compliance. When you think that, for example, Apple is giving AWS some their customer data to store, or any other big company for that matter, you have teams of lawyers who look at every detail to make sure that everything is compliant. And so, when you look at the cloud operators, usually uh, they have a lot of work done in regard to compliance, um, and um, and so how to say, I wouldn't say they are so it doesn't mean that we do have problems at the moment with the Schrems 2 court decision. That's a huge problem, but that's more a political issue at the moment that will need to be solved, because it kind of blocks the data transfer between Europe and United States. So that's quite a big issue, but it's going to get solved at some point. And if you put this point on the side, actually, cloud providers are providing usually quite. I mean, I know AWS really well, and they provide a ton of security features that are very advanced. And so, if you compare to what other cloud provider, we had one huge incident in France where some a cloud provider data center burned completely. So it was quite a huge issue, because all customers' data, of course, ended up in smokes. And usually it shows that there's quite some problems. It's very fires happen, but data center burning entirely, that's much that shows there might have been some quite problems. So the cloud providers, they do concentrate a lot of expertise, and sometimes it's if it's well deployed, it can be a good insurance that a lot of security best practices are well implemented.
All right, cool. You kind of already talked about this, but what happens when we break GDPR? You talked about fines, but we just, quote unquote, just talking about money, or are there any other consequences for a company? And that's the size of the company influence the kind of fine or the kind of problems they can run into if they break GDPR.
Yeah, in terms of fine, you have to think a few things. First, just to get over the amount of fines. So it can be so there's a mixed system depending on the size of the company. If you're a small company, the maximum amount of fine can be 20 million euro, and if you're a big company, it would be 4% of the global turnover, which can turn in basically very important fines. In all
Yeah.
cases, the point what happened when the GDPR was adopted is that we thought how we can ensure that businesses or organizations generally cannot do risk management with GDPR, and how we can ensure that the cost of a fine will be way more important than the cost of implementation. So that was a huge problem before, because before GDPR, the cost of implementation of GDPR was far less than the fine. So no one
Right.
implemented anything at the end of the day. So this changed. So this is a structural point. Now, not being compliant with GDPR will expose the organization to a lot of problems. And the truth is, a lot of problems are not necessarily will not necessarily will start to arise immediately. But the first point is, if an employee, a lot of people think, oh, the National Control Authority will come and they will fine us. It's actually not at all. That never happens like this. What happens is, if you have a conflict inside the company, inside the organization, if you have a conflict and this conflict can transform into a GDPR conflict, then it's a huge power struggle between the parties. So, for example, if you have an employee that has a fight with his organization, is not happy, the organization decide to fire him. Um, if the organization is not GDPR compliant, it's a huge lever to pressure the organization to say, "Oh, you are not compliant with this, so we will start procedure," and then it can cause a lot of problems. So, how to say, uh, fines can happen for a lot of reasons, but really, in terms of risk management, organization need to think: what are my current conflicts? Are these conflicts can these conflicts can degenerate in GDPR conflicts? For example, if you have a lot of customer complaints, can these customer complaints translate into a GDPR complaint? And this can be a real disaster for the organization. So yeah, it's definitely something that you need to pay attention to, because it can be quite painful. So there's, of course, there's the administrative fines that's possible, but there's also there's also a lot of publicity related to a fine. So if someone gets a fine, you can be sure it will be quite all over the news, and it can
Right.
really, depending on what you're doing, it can hurt a lot of businesses. We had in France, for example, some businesses that really lost 20-40% of their turnover because of these fines. One was very famous. It was a business that was giving lessons to kids. So they found teachers for piano lessons, for math lessons, everything. And unfortunately, they had a file. They had some CRM or something like this, and they were writing pretty bad comments about kids and about parents. And someone complained, and the National Control Authority just came and started to request an extract of all the data, and they found horrible things in these comments. And then they, of course, it was all over the news. And when this happens, usually, as a parent, you don't want to go to this
Right.
to this organization anymore, because you know what kind of comments you will get about your kids. So it's not. So yeah, this has also a quite important impact.
That's interesting. All right. And looking at it from like a practical point of view, like you mentioned, like those cases, something that happens a lot is companies reaching out to people out of the blue with emails, like, about their services, or even contacting them about potential meetups on these are usually like small startups, and sometimes the only way they have to reach out at the beginning is through this process of cold emailing. Is this GDPR compliant? Are they breaking any rules when they do that?
It's possible to do this and to be GDPR compliant. It's very possible to do prospecting, but it's really a matter of how you do it. So it's, for example, GDPR will be really strict on how you're collecting the data. And so, for example, I will give you two different examples to make it very clear.
Right.
If you're targeting, for example, B2C, and you're collecting emails on somewhere on the internet, that's probably a very bad idea. Probably a very, very bad idea, because not only we have a GDPR that applies, but we also have other regulations, because there's been so many abuses with robocalls and all these things. Immediately it will put you in a spammer category, and of course GDPR will apply. We will have a lot of compliance questions, tough compliance questions to ask, and probably at the end of the process, we're going to look at it. It's going to be quite expensive, quite difficult to make it compliant. Not
Right.
to say impossible, but it's going to be really difficult. On the other side, if I'm looking at a company who is, for example, prospecting on LinkedIn, for example, is trying to contact some other businesses, then it's way more easy to make it work from GDPR compliance perspective, and to ensure that you have a legitimate interest to contact the person to propose your services, and it's in this commercial sphere. So GDPR doesn't make a distinction between B2B and B2C. Um, so it doesn't really matter. But generally, it's more commonly accepted that when when your email is used for business purposes, that it's also you might receive business solicitation in one way or another, and that's more of in the range of what's accepted. So it's easier to it's completely doable. You can completely build a process and implement a process that ensures that you can contact some companies, propose your services, but be careful what you're doing with the data. Be careful how you're collecting the data, and ensure to always give control to people over their own data. So if you're collecting some data on LinkedIn, for example, you contact some person, be sure to give that person control over their data. Say, I collected your data on LinkedIn. I'm sending you an email because I thought you could be interested by these services. You're working in this area, and if you have an interest, I would be happy to have a discussion with you. And if it's not the case, we will not contact you anymore, and your data will be removed from our database. That's it's a simple way. There's a little bit more to this, but this is the direction you should be going.
Right. Right. Okay. And on that note, then, what are the red lines that companies should never cross? What are the big no-nos when it comes to the GDPR? You kind of pointed at scrapping emails from the web, but what other things are we like not supposed to do as companies?
So, if there's a lot of behind this question. There's a lot of business models, a lot of apps, a lot of developers who are doing a lot of different things. I would say first, the question can be how you collect the data. That's a really first point. I would say if you want to dig a little bit these questions, you can look at Article 9, which describes a list of personal data that's very, very sensitive. For example, health data, data relating to political opinions, data relating to sexual life, data related to sexual orientation. These are very sensitive data points. And so if you're processing this data, you really have to take a look at. It's difficult to give you really red lines. Basically, just understand that what the GDPR imposes is uh, to exactly tell your data tell data subjects what you're doing with the data, how you're processing it, how you're managing it, and to give them control over this data. That's the main thing. So if you're not giving any control over that data to in regard to the data you're collecting from persons, that's already a bad sign. If you're not securing the data when there's real risk, that's really, really a bad sign. So those are a few elements that you can think about. If I have like a few advice for developers, you can read just 2 articles of the GDPR. Don't read everything; it's way too long. But just read 2 articles. Read Article 5 because it sets a set of principles of what you should do and not, and this gives you the logic, the general logic of GDPR. For example, a principle of transparency: you should be transparent in regard to the data you're processing, what you do with it, how long you're processing it, these kind of elements. And the other article is Article 32 because it gives you very precise IT security rules on how you should secure the data. And as a developer, the language used in the Article 32 is very close to technical language that more or less everyone can understand. It's about confidentiality, integrity, resilience, about IT security audits. So these are really practical things that you can implement straight away.
Awesome. It's nice to have like the short version of a regulation because, like you said, it can be really hard and difficult to understand and go through the entire thing. But if you go through specific points, then it's much easier. All right. Finally, as users, let's look at the other side. Not developers, but developers, but being users. What kind of rights or abilities does GDPR give you over the data you generate? Kind of pointed at it like we as users should have the ability to or governance over the data that is being tracked about us. Is that so?
Yeah, that's very much so. So basically, GDPR gives you control over your data. So there's one you can think about it as a developer as it's like ownership of the data. So we as lawyers we don't use this term for one specific reason is that ownership it's property, and property is mostly used for circulation of goods. So as a developer, you can say someone we have to give ownership of their data so they can do what they want with them. That's okay. From legal perspective, it's a disaster. Why? Because for a simple reason, because ownership means exclusivity. So if I own something, I'm the only one who owns it. But the point of property is to transfer, to circulate goods. So if I sell something to you, I can't use it anymore. So if I have my first name, my last name, and you think personal data is ownership, it's property, then if I sell this, I can't use it anymore, and that's a
Right.
huge problem. That's why, from legal perspective, there's no way property rights can work over personal data because it's an exclusive right, and then you can't use it. And what you will do without your name, without your first name, without your last name, it's going to be a little bit hard to live. But from just simple understanding, if you're a developer, the idea of ownership is kind of it's a simplification that kind of works. So basically, the GDPR really gives you control over your data. So for most organizations, you can ask data subject can ask, give me all the data you have on me, all your processing that's related to me, and you have to give this data. It's an access right, Article 15, and anyone can request the all data organization have on them. So that's a perfect right. And you have different level of controls. You can, for example, if data is not correct, you can ask, oh, I want to rectify this data because it's not my first name written correctly, or it's not my last name written correctly, or some data elements are not correct, and you can ask to this data to be modified. One famous funny example, well, that's not very funny for the person originally, but originally we had one case in France that was a quite interesting case. We had one person from Lebanon who was coming regularly to France, and he was very unfortunate because his first name and the last name was exactly the same as a terrorist. So unfortunately for him, when he arrived in France, immediately custom service immediately grabbed him and put him in jail for 48 hours, questioned him until he explained that, of course, he was not this terrorist, but he had the same name. But the problem is that in their databases, they collected first name, last name, but they didn't collect the date of birth. And so he went like this one time, two times, three times in France, and after some time he was like, every time he's passing the border, he was just grabbed again for 48 hours and saying, no, I just can't live my life like this. I have to go to
Right.
France regularly, and it's just not a way. And at this time he used the previous version of GDPR, which is the same regulation that we had in France, to request that that in this secret services, if you want, databases, that they actually added at least the first name, last name, and his date of birth, so they could make sure that they could ensure that it was not that person was not exactly the same terrorist. And so and he did he went to court and he won his case, and intelligence services had to add this last name, this date of birth, to make sure that okay, it was not this person. So we have quite a lot of control over our own data. So it works in a lot of cases, but doesn't work in all cases. For example, when data processing is required by law, for example, the most interesting example I use often is for tax authority. If anyone could say, no, don't process my personal data in all cases, and if it was exclusive, I can tell you that a lot of people will send me, emails to tax authorities like, no, sorry, from now on, you will not be able to process my personal data.
Right.
And of course, this doesn't work also. So we have a balanced, this is what we try to reach in law. That's why the balance is often the symbol of justice. Is we're trying to reach a good balance between the rights of an individual person and the rights of a society in this case. So you have to think, as a developer, give as much control as possible in regard to the personal data of a person. Give them information. This is important. A data subject need to be informed of all the data you have on them, you're collecting. And then there's like a lot of subtleties in regard to this. For example, if it's in a sale, you can process the data, the time, for quite some time to deliver your services, and to keep it quite some time. But yeah, main idea is really that GDPR gives control over the data that's processed by organizations.
Interesting. All right. That's it. That was the last question I had. Thank you so much for covering GDPR with us. Now, I usually ask 3 more questions to our guests that are not
Mhm.
specifically about the topic. They're just the same
Mhm.
question to everyone. As a developer turned lawyer, maybe your answers will be interesting to our audience. So the first one is, what is the best advice you ever received?
The best advice I received. You mean like ever? Like,
We usually ask within the context of their career, but feel free to pick whatever context you want.
wow, that's a really interesting question. The best advice I received. No, honestly, I don't know.
All right. Interesting.
Honestly, I don't know. It's like I think at the end of the day, a lot of things you have to figure out yours. I mean, not yourself, but it's you're figuring a lot of things yourself. Advices, I would say, no. I don't know, because at the end of the day, I can throw some generalities to what you like in life. You have to do some things, but it's not really helpful. As a professional advice, what I would say, maybe the most interesting thing to me is to always think delivering value. Always think about the value you're delivering, and always try to maybe target to deliver a little bit more. How you can think in terms of 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 your profession, how you could uh, you know grow to deliver more value to more users, to more people.
That's great advice. That's nice. All right. The second question always is related to IT, but it doesn't have to be IT in your case. You've been through both worlds, so it's interesting to get your opinion there. What is the most interesting project you worked on? It could be your current job. It could be anything really.
The most interesting project, I think it was when I was doing my PhD, because for me personally, that was the hardest. It was really, really hard. And it's also maybe the moment where I learned the most about structure. Generally speaking, in life, you're always confronted but often we're confronted, not always, thank God, but we're often confronted between two forces, order and chaos. And anyone who ever did an IT project knows what chaos means. And very often, that's what we do. We structure things at the end of the day. When you're an IT developer, you are building components, smaller components, then you're refactoring. And at the end of the day, what you're doing is really rationalizing something in providing a structure in order to put order into something that can be chaotic. And I think for me, maybe the most interesting was, I mean, at least one of the things that I learned the most is really where I learned structure, how to structure things, how to decompose in small pieces. Uh, and this is really an important skill because um, this is where you will always be confronted in life in projects where you have to bring structure into something that has no order. And when now I'm starting a new project, that will probably be super interesting. And it's complete chaos because and this is what we start to do. We start to put a back end together. We start to put a front end. So already we start to separate to create a structure. And in this back end there will be different microservices, and this is front end. We're going to have different elements. We're going to have a data store. We're going to have different components, subcomponents, and this probably one of the main skill that if you grow this skill in life, in how to create structure, you can really go through life. It's a considerable tool to go through life. Whatever happens, we're all confronted to a lot of events. We see on the news every day a lot of different events that can impact us. And one of the great force we have as human beings is really to structure things.
All right, great answer, actually. And final question, and I think you probably already answered it, but what is one thing that you wish you knew when you started working that you eventually realized over the years?
Yeah, that I can very clearly articulate. I think um, the one of the like super important things as a business owner, as generally even as a developer, as is really to think about the scope of the project, the problem you're working on. And this is, I worked, so I created LaserScope, which is a GDPR compliance application, and we're quite automating quite a lot of processes in regard to GDPR compliance. That was the objective. And after really working on this for some time, I thought if I had just applied the same skill to a different problem, uh, a, uh, a lot of different consequences would have happened. And there's really a lot of thinking that needs to be done, and I see a lot of people working on how to say, not small problems, but maybe problems where the scope, it's because some problems are really super interesting to work on. For example, for me, GDPR compliance is super interesting. I love it. It's my field of expertise. But sometimes I think, no, if I just apply the same knowledge to other area, the scope of change would have been much bigger. And therefore, really, we have very finite amount of time in life. And I would really challenge everyone to think very deeply about the scope of the problem you're solving. I really don't like to call it small problems, but it's like uh, how how much an impact, how much, what's the consequences of solving this problem. And if you think, it's when you talk to investors, for example, they will try to work on, or to invest in companies that have a huge market. Why? Because it's usually a huge problem. And if you apply your same skills in 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 a big problem, and if you apply your same skill, the same person, you apply the same skills to a small problem and you apply the same skills to big problems, the consequences of your life will be very, very different.
All right, cool. Nice advice. That's it. Now we're done with the interview. Thank you so much. Can you please tell the audience where they can find you? How can they reach out to you if they want to know more about GDPR?
Yeah. So the simplest way is to go to legiscope.com. So it's a GDPR compliance platform where we try to automate as much as possible all the process that needs to be in place for an organization to be compliant. So that's probably the simplest way to find me around there. We have a lot of trainings, a lot of tools that help organization if they have this issue. It's a good it's a good tool to help them.
All right, awesome. We'll make sure to add a link to it on the show notes. That's
All
it.
right.
Well, then, thank you again, Thibaut.
Thank you very much.
It was really interesting and hopefully interesting also to our listeners and to everyone listening. Thank you so much, and catch you on the next one. All right, bye.
Cool. Bye.
And that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. And if you haven't yet, take 10 seconds and leave a review of the show on your podcasting app. It will help us grow and reach more developers. And while you're at it, follow us on Twitter at the 20MinJS. This episode was brought to you by OpenReplay, an open source session replay platform for developers. Visit openreplay.com to know more. And I'll see you back here next week.